there was an opinion piece that appeared just the other day in the New York Times, How Liberals Can Reclaim Nationalism by Yasha Mounk. Yasha argues that, basically it's time to throw in the towel. Nationalism is back. Supranational organizations, unaccountable international globalist organizations are losing legitimacy, and nationalism is back. But liberals can co-opt and subvert nationalism to make it more inclusive. And there's a lot of problems with this article, this opinion piece, a lot of, in my opinion, probably deliberate lies. And one of the most basic is conflating nationalism with the nation state. Now, he argues that nationalism is a pretty new phenomenon, I guess like a 19th and 20th century phenomenon, and a tremendously destructive one, according to him. And he seems to be conflating nationalism here with the nation state. And while the nation state is indeed a fairly novel innovation, nationalism is not. And nationalism, or nation, has traditionally been understood to be a people with a common culture, heritage, language, ethnicity, ancestry. That's a nation. And so states have historically been typically either subnational or even supranational. Like the Holy Roman Empire was a confederation of many, many subnational states that encompassed most of modern-day Germany, a large part of Italy, and even extended into Eastern Europe. That was a pretty typical arrangement at one point in time. And, the thing about this is these arrangements got stomped on by nation-states in the 19th and 20th centuries. And many of them were reorganized into nation-states. In the case of the Holy Roman Empire, this happened starting with France and Napoleon sweeping through the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire had a tremendous amount of trouble resisting because France was a centralized nation state. It could levy taxes directly. It could conscript soldiers directly. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire was dependent on feudal levies for revenue and troops. And so it was tremendously hard to organize. And they got stomped. They got their shit pushed in by Napoleon. And so this was the impetus for Germany unifying under the Prussians into the German Empire. And a lot of the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire became the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well, which continued to be an international, or a multinational state of the old style. And that got stomped in World War I. So, the nation state was a new innovation, but it's one that arose because of its ability to raise revenue and raise troops in an age of, let's say, total war or democratic war. The rule for how states form, the size and the shape of states, is governed by their ability to amass resources. Territory will go to the entity willing and able to pay the most for its defense or its acquisition. And so that typically will be to, and also subjects will go to the entity willing and able to pay the most to acquire dominion over them. And so that's typically going to be the entity that can raise the most revenue. And nation states have an advantage here because they can tax income. Nation states can tax income because residents of a nation state are not going to pick up and move to a different nation in order to find a more favorable tax jurisdiction in most cases. They're not going to want to learn a new language, adopt a new culture, maybe a new religion, in order to find more favorable tax conditions. And so a nation state can impose income taxes and extract a higher amount of revenue from a given population than either a subnational or a supranational state. Now, if you have a supranational state with many nations in it, then there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflicts of interest. People are going to resent transfer of wealth and other things that are going on from revenue that's extracted from them. And it's going to be inefficient in that way at scale. If you have a subnational entity, then there's going to be a lot more tax competition between those subnational entities. If all you have to do to find a more favorable tax jurisdiction is move a few miles down the river or a few miles down the road, then people are going to be a lot more willing to do that. If they can keep their language, if they can keep their culture, and they can still visit their extended families on the weekends, they're going to be a lot more willing to live and work in another tax jurisdiction. And so a collection of subnational states is going to be able to extract much less resources from a population in total. Even if you add up the sum of all these subnational entities, they're going to be able to extract much less in total from a given area and a given population than a nation state would be able to do. And that's why a nation state can gain and maintain control over the territory inhabited by a nation, a group of people with a common ethnic and linguistic and cultural and religious heritage. So briefly speaking, that's why the nation state arose. Nations predate nation states. And, in a time when government was very localized due to transportation issues and communication issues, maybe it wasn't practical to scale states up to the size of nation states, and that's why we had an extended period of feudalism with subnational states. And then later on with supranational states, before things eventually settled down into nation states. But that's competitive. That's what's going to arise and persist and endure. So that there's nothing untoward about that. Now, as for the suggestion that nations should be constructed along civic lines and be inclusive of individuals from all different kinds of backgrounds, well, that's just fucking stupid, because those people aren't going to have the same kind of affinity for each other. They're not going to be cooperative with each other in the same way that people who are akin and similar along more dimensions are going to have an affinity and be cooperative and trusting and cohesive and loyal and have common purposes and common causes. Those kind of inclusive nations are going to be weak and fragmented and fractured and internally contentious compared to more homogeneous and trustworthy nations. And so, homogeneous and trustworthy nations are going to be dominant. They're going to be competitive in any number of dimensions: economic, military, what have you. So, this is just more leftist advocacy of parasitism, of dysgenia. They want to continue to force the redistribution of resources from populations, from groups of people that have eugenically achieved a class distribution, biased more towards the middle and upper classes, from them to groups that have dysgenically maintained a distribution, a class distribution biased towards underclasses. And they want to do this for self-serving motives. People like Yasha no doubt want to preserve their ability to infiltrate and gain influence over all nations and to undertake this redistribution, in order to skim a share of the spoils for themselves, and also to create, these fractured, contentious, multi-ethnic states that they consider to be safer for their people and their interests for some reason, more so than their own homogeneous ethno-state, which they already have, but which they seek to deny us and all others. A lot of problems with this view, and it's long-term, it's not competitive. It's not workable. It's just an argument for weakness and parasitism and fraud and corruption and influence and subversion and all of these terrible things that make nations weaker and poorer and less competitive. And these so-called inclusive nations, these civic nations, are going to be stamped out in the coming centuries. They're going to fail. They're going to fall. They're going to be conquered. They're going to be whatever, dispossessed, displaced, ethnically cleansed. And he's actually creating the conditions for all of this stuff. all of this bad stuff that he blames on nationalism. But nationalism is not the cause of this. Nationalism is the solution to this. And if you have distinct nations, if you have separate nations where you don't have parasitism between different groups of people, you don't have free riding between different groups of people, then this is going to maximize cooperation, and it's going to maximize trust, and it's going to maximize peace versus mixing everybody together and shaking them up and letting them fight it out, Mad Max style. That's fucking stupid. And he's the cause of the conflict that he decries. He's the cause of the all the issues that he pins on nationalism. His fucking stupidity and malice and corruption. So I talked about revenue and maximizing revenue. That's one reason nation states arise. And if you're kind of a libertarian mindset, you might think of this as a bad thing. And it can be. But, one advantage of this within a homogeneous nation is that the nation can invest in commons. And so investing in commons in a high-trust homogeneous nation is something that you can do, and it enriches everybody. And if the leadership of the nation is akin to the populace of the nation, then their interests are going to be aligned to a fairly high extent. And the leadership of the nation, especially if you have like a hereditary monarchy, where they have very long-term incentives, and where externalized costs between subjects are internalized as private costs to the monarch, which is a very good incentive structure, then you can invest this revenue in commons, whether it's defense or education or even a little bit of redistribution to help out your underclasses. Then, all of these things, infrastructure can be a good thing, can be a productive investment. And so this revenue can be put to good purposes, and as long as there's an alignment of interest between sovereigns and subjects, then it's not necessarily a parasitic zero-sum transfer. It can be an investment that helps out everyone, or nearly everyone, or at least the relevant people in a society. And it makes sense for nations and states to be based on kinship, because kinship makes altruism and reciprocity evolutionarily self-enforcing. Because if you are being altruistic, if you are being trusting, if you are being trustworthy, if you're practicing reciprocity, under normal circumstances that would be naturally, let's say, sacrificial. You'd be bearing costs without any guarantee of receiving benefits in return. But under a situation where there's kinship, there's relationship between the people involved, then it's evolutionarily a stable strategy, because you're helping out other instances of your own genes. And if they help you out in turn, all the better. They're helping you out, and so everybody can win. And that's something that happens naturally when there's kinship involved. So that's a very natural way to organize nation and state. And it decreases the cost of cooperation, and therefore increases the volume of cooperation and the benefit to everyone. And this is something that arises in simulations. When you simulate humanitarian behavior versus traitorous behavior versus ethnocentric behavior using, agent simulations. This is something that arises. You get a lot of clusters of kinship-based clusters where there's high cooperation in-group and reciprocity in-group, and those groups outcompete others. And this is what happened in politics and in human, ethnographics, and it's what's going to happen again. It's inevitable. All right, because this is the most competitive strategy. And, parasites like Yasha Mounk notwithstanding, you can't change the fundamental forces that lead to this. You can disrupt them for a while, but you can't change them. You can't change the incentives. You can't change the pressures. You can't change the forces that lead to this. And, nationalism permits eugenic standards and practices to be adopted in-group. Now, if you're constantly flooding the in-group with out-group parasites, dysgenic parasites, you can't do that. But nationalism and isolation between groups is not only the only way to maximize cooperation, because cooperation is higher in-group, but it's also the only way to achieve eugenia for all groups.